This week's number, 100. That's how many days a professor at the University of South Florida spent underwater setting a new world record. He was studying the effect of higher atmospheric pressure and its potential for slowing the aging process. When I get near water, I shrink by 2 inches. Welcome to Prof G Markets. Today, we're discussing U.S. interest rates, what Andreessen Horowitz's new London office means for the U.K., and the top beer brand in America. Ed, I came up with that joke on my own. Joke on my own.
It's very good.
All right.
You know, I got some interesting feedback from a friend recently.
Yeah.
He was having a conversation with his mum, who's a big fan of this podcast. And she said, I wish Scott would make the sex jokes at the end of the podcast because Grandma would really like the analysis, but I can't share it with her because if she listens to the first 2 minutes, she'll think I'm insane. So
there you go.
That's the new.
You know what the feedback I get is around that stuff?
What is it?
Never change. Never change. All right.
I agree. I think we should keep it. How's the countryside?
Out at Soho Farmhouse. It is lovely. I'm here in the Cotswolds, which is a place I've never been before. Mm-hmm. The British countryside is beautiful. It's spectacular here. I'm at something called Founders Forum. Mm-hmm. A lot of founders. This guy named Brent Hoberman, who's a lovely guy, and a lot of interesting people kind of, doing their thing, finding out what you do and if you can invest in their company, their new disruptive Jell-O making company or whatever it is. It's nice to be around young people. It's strange though. Mm-hmm. I feel very old here, so I may not come back again. But the British countryside is striking. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I want to go shooting something or taking pictures of birds or taking long walks.
You went shooting a couple of weeks ago, right? I saw that on your calendar.
Yeah, I was supposed to. Anyways, longer story, but yeah, I'm mostly thinking about running against Rick Scott for senator in 2024 in Florida, and I feel like any Democrat, I have to pretend that I'm actually, down with gun ownership and have pictures of me killing terrified fowl. Anyways, let's talk about the news, Ed. Let's talk about the markets.
Let's do it. Let's start with our weekly review of market vitals. The S&P gained, and Bitcoin and Treasury yields fell. Shifting to the headlines. The FTC filed for a temporary restraining order to block Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard. The deal must be completed or dissolved by July 18th, and Microsoft will have to pay a $3 billion termination fee if it falls through. European Union regulators charged Google with violating antitrust laws. The EU accused the company of abusing its dominance in the market for ads on third-party websites. The US Department of Justice filed similar charges against the company in January. The Justice Department is investigating the PGA Tour's merger with Live Golf. We discussed that merger on last week's episode. The investigation could delay the transaction by more than a year. Mediterranean restaurant chain Carver went public, as we previewed on this show a few weeks ago. Shares popped more than 100% in its market debut. Thousands of subreddits went dark to protest Reddit's new API pricing model, which charges fees for third-party data access that can be used to train AI tools. The new model has also killed off third-party apps that avid Reddit users rely on to access the site. And finally, the Consumer Price Index showed inflation cooled to 4% in May. That's down from 4.9% the month before. Inflation is now less than half of what it was at its peak in June of last year. Scott, reactions?
I think it's really exciting. I think that 4% number is a victory for the U.S. and it's a victory for Chairman Powell. And that is inflation, when you think about it, is too many dollars facing too few products. And COVID resulted in too few products. And the threat of COVID taking the economy resulted in too much stimulus. So too much money facing too few products. And it feels like the ungunking of the supply chain. And also, people supposedly have about $1 trillion of stimulus left in their bank accounts, but they're ripping through it at $100 billion a month. So supposedly, they got about 10 months left. But Chairman Powell, I think, is put on a masterclass here under huge pressure and a lot of second guessing from both the far right and the far left. Massively jacked up interest rates. Mm-hmm. And our inflation in the U.S. is lower than I think any Western country, or one of the lowest. So I think that's the definition of leadership, is sticking kind of sticking to the right course, regardless of the second guessing and the pushback. So I feel really good about that number. And the target is 2%, but 4% is a long way from wherever it was, 7 or 8%, just what feels like a few months ago. Thousands of subreddits went dark to protest Reddit's new API pricing model. I don't know if this is more kind of the very vocal minority, but I just feel like, isn't that precious that they're upset? It's a for-profit company. Every single one of these companies has done the same thing. Yeah. And there's two sides of this trade. And if these subredditors can find a better deal somewhere, they should do it. And if enough of them leave, they will, Reddit will be forced to reduce the price. But Twitter did the same thing, and it's all about leverage. Now, there might be a broader question around whatever this category is, whether there's just too much concentration that's antitrust. But it is their job to price this product, somewhere between, it's the tension between a penetration model, a larger market share, lower prices, or trying to show more EBITDA, which probably the market wants right now. The market has pivoted, or investors have pivoted, and this is a company that is trying to prep itself for an IPO. The market has pivoted from a desire for growth to a desire for profits. Now, ideally, you have both, but it used to be growth at any cost, even if it meant losing hundreds of millions of dollars. That has totally flipped, and now companies, even software companies, are valued on a multiple of cash flow. So they have to make more money. And isn't that precious that they don't want to pay these fees? Well, okay, it sucks to be a grown-up. You can go somewhere else. And if enough of them go somewhere else, Reddit will withdraw the pricing increase. I see it as fairly straight. The thing that really popped out to me, Ed, was Kava popping 100% in its market debut. I mean, that might be the starting gun for the IPO market. And maybe I'm missing something here, but it was priced and it doubled. Yeah. That is striking for a restaurant company. Now, what does it say? Does it say the IPO market is back, or does it just say that this thing was terribly mispriced, or that people are looking for consumer companies that are a little bit more stable and that kind of take advantage of the Main Street economy? There was a really interesting view from the Apollo CEO where he said we might be entering the non-recession recession. And what he meant by that was that asset prices might take a hit, real estate and stocks, but the vast majority of that is owned by the top 1%, meaning that wages and employment will be fine. And I wonder if Kava is a beneficiary of the belief that, in fact, a recession, even if it quote unquote comes, isn't going to hurt its customer. The Justice Department and the PGA, the PGA, the Justice Department probably should have moved in on the PGA before this. These companies are monopolies. I've never understood how they maintain. I mean, there was a law that I guess exonerated the PGA from, not the PGA, excuse me, Major League Baseball, I guess, from competition. But it strikes me these companies are basically monopolies where they say one team per city. It just strikes me there's a ton of monopoly abuse or monopoly-like abuse in professional sports. I don't know how politically motivated this is. I think it's actually good for golf. I mean, would it have been good if there were two competitors? I don't know, maybe it's better if there's two of them and they're competing against each other. That was probably healthy. It took athletes' pay up, which I think is a good thing. I mean, athlete pay just went down with Liv purchasing the PGA. And let's be honest, it's kind of a creeping takeover that creates fewer buyers for your services. So if you're a golfer, you now have one bidder versus two. So I can see why. I'll be interested to see how this unfolds. But my initial reaction is the Justice Department should look at it. EU regulators charging Google with violating antitrust laws. The EU has been out in front on regulation, and I think it's a good thing. It's no news that Google is a monopoly when it comes to digital advertising. They're both the buyer, the seller, and the market maker. So I don't know what impact this will have. It's very hard to convince a company or to break up a company that's not headquartered in your or not domiciled in your region. So I don't know if it matters for the broader company. What they could do is decide that they're guilty of antitrust and prohibit them from operating in the European markets or start finding the shit out of them. But the larger question is, are we seeing the peak? Are we at peak of big tech? When big tech starts to bump up against 30% of the market cap of the entire S&P, when Apple's hitting $3 trillion, when you have so much regulatory scrutiny, when consumers are realizing that their kid is addicted to their phone and that these apps don't have their best interest at heart and they aren't connecting the world, have we in fact maybe hit peak big tech? And we'll see. But the EU has been a leader around this stuff, and I say more power to them. And around the temporary restraining order to block Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard, what's interesting is the market doesn't seem to care. The market seems to not like the acquisition. And despite the $3 billion exit fee, the market has taken Microsoft stock up. It appears that the market believes that either Microsoft was about to overpay or just doesn't care. It just feels like the core business is so strong. So to me, that's makes for good news, but I don't think it's actually that important for Microsoft or for Activision. Activision will go down in value, but this to me is not a big deal. What are your thoughts, Ed?
You covered everything. Let's see. I mean, Carver, I think, is pretty interesting because we've been talking about, we said that Instacart would probably be the IPO that would jumpstart the IPO market. What I'd be interested to see is how much retail interest was pouring into Carver when Carver went public. As you said, there's this idea that it may have been mispriced, but also they could have just, I mean, this might also be a function of mispricing, but they also may have miscalculated just how much retail interest there is. And I don't have the specific stats, but what we've been seeing over the past few months is that retail investing is basically coming back, and people thought that it was dead all of last year. So I wonder if Carver is sort of the green light on retail investors getting back in the market, and it's possible that it is with a 2x on the debut.
Yeah, it's really that just stuck out to me. Also, just some data going back to Reddit. 57 million people visit Reddit every day. It has 430 million monthly active users and generated 424 million in revenue in 2022. So this is a real company, and they're planning an IPO later this year. So Reddit is cleaning itself up. I think Reddit could be a monster IPO.
Okay, let's move on to our first story. For the first time in 15 months, Fed Chair Jerome Powell decided not to raise interest rates. The Fed has instead chosen to hold rates steady, but signaled it will raise them again next month if inflation doesn't come down further. This decision comes after the release of mixed economic data. On the one hand, inflation appears to be slowing. On the other hand, the job market is still very hot. US employers added nearly 350,000 jobs in May, and the unemployment rate still remains near historic lows. Despite the pause, policymakers expect 2 additional quarter-point increases this year, and that would lift the Fed funds rate to a target range between 5.5 and 5.75%. Scott, the market had priced in a pause this month, and Jay Powell delivered. Was that the right move?
I think so. I'm just heartened that there's really bright, high-character people like Chairman Powell to handle this shit. It's really interesting because if you go one level down, if you go to the president or representatives or the Senate, we get a lot of crazies. When it comes to the Treasury Secretary or the head of the Fed, it's as if everyone says, okay, playtime is over. We need an adult. Secretary Yellen is an adult. And even the president, as partisan they are, they usually leave that person in place. Some of it's because they're appointed for longer tenures. But I think what they're saying is, okay, there's partisan politics, there's even laws, and then there's the economy, and this shit's for real. We need to have really thoughtful people who don't scare that easily. So you're right. The market was expecting a pause. I think he's probably a little bit freaked out about what happened at SVB, and everything's heading his way. Stuff's heading the right direction. So I don't think he felt a need. I feel as if he thought he could take his foot off the brake, if you will.
Well, the point you bring up about there are no crazies in this position, I think that's just a function of the fact that the Fed chair isn't democratically elected. The Fed chair is appointed by the president. And usually when you have those appointments, sort of like what the China government does with a technocratic, authoritarian style of governing, you get less crazy people. But putting all that aside, just to provide some pushback against his decision, I think some officials favored a hike. And the argument was that, we've been hit by these data surprises, specifically the higher job vacancies. There's more employment creation happening. There's also the fact that the debt ceiling is suddenly not an issue now that it's been resolved. So some would say that we've got sort of a job half done and that we still need to stamp out inflation. Do you agree with that at all?
The honest answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, just a month ago, people were saying that his massive acceleration in interest rates was literally ruining the economy. So it's like, okay, well, which is it? It strikes me that when inflation is coming down at this precipitous a rate, when you have what appeared to be some externalities or unintended consequences of this massive interest rate acceleration, a historic interest rate acceleration, that's saying we're going to take a pause until we have more data, that just seems infinitely reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And something we were talking about a couple of weeks ago relating to interest rates is just this general sea change for investors. And, it might be an obvious point, but it's a point that needs to be made. And that is 2 years ago, you'd get a 0.5% yield on a 2-year treasury. And just across the economy, there was basically a near zero incentive to go into any fixed income investments. And today, a 2-year treasury gets you 4.7%. You can get a 1-year bond from Apple yielding 4.8%. And then you compare that to the S&P last year, which, accounting for dividend payments, returned negative 21%. So for the first time in more than a decade, it's like bonds are the new stocks. And, you've made this point before, but from an investing perspective, what are some of the main macro effects that you're seeing as a result of this non-zero interest rate environment? And have any of those effects in particular surprised you?
Well, the obvious one is what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. I don't think anyone saw that coming. And I don't know if that was a function of the massive interest rate acceleration or banking in a handheld world where you can get all of your capital out in about 3 minutes.
Right.
So there's no friction. There's no sleep on it, have to go to the bank. It's just like, oh, you get an email from your VC, boom, I transfer all of my money from SVB to JP Morgan in 3 or 5 minutes. The impact on the economy might be when corporations and homeowners have to roll and refinance. I'm going to have to refinance the mortgage on my Florida house. I've got about a 2.5% mortgage. Actually, it's 2.375, I think. And that's likely going to increase to 5+%, which will increase my mortgage by, 50% plus.
Yep.
And I imagine there's just a lot of people that the doubling of their housing costs is really meaningful and will likely reduce their spend across other categories. So, this is, I don't know. I don't know if it's rolling in slowly and the economy is strong enough to absorb that. The shit you worry about is usually not the stuff that gets you. It's the stuff you're not worried about. And everyone's talking about the implosion of commercial real estate. And my guess is that's turning into another thing like this illusory recession that if we talk about it enough, banks will plan for it and try and give forbearance and just sort of slowly work it out, if you will, or entrepreneurs will step in with ideas for repurposing. I don't know. As a consumer, I had one of those moments where I have never owned a bond. I've just always been in stocks because, when I was younger, I had a much more aggressive risk profile, and I wanted to own investments that could double in value theoretically in 6 months. And the idea of owning a bond just seemed so boring and lame to me. And then over the last 10 years, as the idea of steady cash flow and diversifying or de-risking sounded good, you didn't get paid for it. I've been on boards. I remember I was on the board of Urban Outfitters, and we had a bunch of cash. So we were doing stock buybacks, and someone said, we can borrow money at like 2 or 2.5%. I'm like, well, just borrow money then. I mean, when I was running L2, and we took $15 or $20 million in venture funding from General Catalyst, Comerica showed up and said, we'll give you $5 million in venture debt because we follow tier one VCs around and offer a quarter of the initial principal invested in the form of venture debt. And the interest rate I had to pay on it was 3.25%. And so I said, send me the paperwork. And I signed it, and they wired in $5 million. And I did not need it. But when you have the opportunity to get $5 million for 3.25%, you take it. Now, the flip side of that is you don't invest when you're not getting paid for it. So I would never invest in a bond that had any risk at all, which everything does, except for maybe treasuries when you're getting not paid for it. I had some money. I had a big win recently, and the money got wired in, I don't know when it was, last week. And I immediately thought, I need to put it to work in something. I need to start figuring this out. And my guy who handles my account called me and goes, well, right now we just have it in I think it was this treasury or 6-month treasury account, and it's yielding 5.4%. And I'm like, really? I'm getting 5.4% in what it appears to be fairly risk-free securities? He said, yeah. And I said, what was it last year? And he said, I think it was like 60 basis points or 30 basis points. So what it did for me was I immediately didn't feel a need to go out and try and find investments in stocks. So I would think, credit feels undervalued right now and stocks probably feel overvalued. Now, I don't know what that, when, stocks generally do really well in a low interest rate environment because bonds aren't as appealing. Now that bonds are really appealing, does that mean stocks are going to come down? I don't know. But it absolutely has changed my kind of investment complexion. For the first time, I own bonds. I own 6 months treasury. If someone had said to me, you're going to own 6-month T-bills, I would have said, okay, that means I have prostate cancer and I'm on a cruise. I mean, that just means, not that there's anything wrong with either of those things, but I own 6-month treasuries, and I like the idea of being more patient and opportunistic around if and when, shit gets real and I can swoop in and, buy a Gulfstream for $1 down.
So did you put the money in that treasury yield account?
Yeah, I did.
All of it, or are you
most of it? And I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to try and be more opportunistic and see what happens. And it's fun to have cash. I never have cash. I've always thought put money to work. That's always been my mantra. Put it to work. Get it to work right away. In a company, a small company, an investment, something, a stock. And this time I'm like, well, let's just wait till something really fun comes along or really interesting. Which is, anyways, just it's a strange feeling.
Right.
The flip side is I got to refi a bunch of real estate at dramatically higher rates.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our second story. The UK is facing difficult economic conditions with sluggish GDP growth and inflation at 8%. But Prime Minister Rishi Sunak recently found reason for optimism with the opening of a new business in London, venture firm Andreessen Horowitz's first international office. The firm's new UK outpost will focus on crypto startups, a bet that the British government will offer kinder regulation than the US. Prime Minister Sunak described the new office as, quote, another huge vote of confidence in the UK. He later added, quote, as we cement the UK's place as a science and tech superpower, we must embrace new innovations like Web3 powered by blockchain technology. Sunak then went on to say, that's why I'm thrilled world-leading investor Andreessen Horowitz has decided to open their first international office in the UK. So, Scott, a big deal for Andreessen Horowitz, apparently a pretty big deal for the Prime Minister too. Do you have any thoughts on this move?
I feel as if the way I would summarize this is the incredible shrinking United Kingdom. Can you imagine the president or President Biden announcing and making a big deal around, I don't know, Naspers, or I don't know who the biggest hedge fund in Europe is, opening a headquarters in New York? He wouldn't care. He wouldn't. I mean, it just strikes me, when I read it, it made me just feel sort of bummed about the United Kingdom, that this is the best they can talk about. This is their lead story. Hey, a VC's moving here. I mean, I'd be curious to know, maybe you know this, like how many employees, how many people are actually moving here? What is it, 50 or 100? What are your thoughts?
Well, so for one, I mean, Andreessen Horowitz has around 500 employees. So I don't know, assume like 10% of them move. That's 50 people that he's celebrating. But yeah, I agree. And
so why didn't we get an announcement when I opened L2 in London? We had as many people here.
Exactly.
Prime Minister.
Exactly. Well, I think the main thing that you mentioned, that the UK's economic situation is bad. It's really bad. I mean, 8.7% inflation, that's one of the highest in Europe. It's barely up from a year ago when it was 9%. Plus, you've got really low unemployment, wages still rising. It's sort of the worst of both worlds when it comes to inflation. And then the other thing that I saw recently is that the yields on short-term gilts, and that's the UK's equivalent of a treasury, the yields on those gilts have exploded in the past few months. In other words, investors are pricing in the fact that interest rates will have to keep rising. And I don't know if you remember, in September, we discussed those gilt yields after Liz Truss announced her mini budget, which was basically an economic disaster. It tanked the UK economy and sent yields soaring. So currently, the yield on short-term gilts is higher than they were in September. So it's just a disaster. And then you look at the UK more generally. Since the pandemic, the UK has shrunk. The UK's economy, its GDP has shrunk 0.5%. It's the only major economy in Europe to do that. Tech investment is down almost 60%. And then there's this crazy stat about the IPO market. 7 of 10 UK IPOs in the past decade have lost money. That is, the stock is now trading below the IPO issuance price. So yeah, you have an economy that's basically burying its own grave. And then the Prime Minister comes out and proudly announces that this VC firm with a pretty ubiquitous reputation for backing some of the biggest grifts of all time is opening an office in London. And then he calls it a huge vote of confidence. I agreed. I can't think of a smaller and worse vote of confidence than this.
In addition, Andreessen Horowitz has raised about $8 billion across 4, get this, crypto funds.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine, just as the UK had a massive inflow of capital after they passed very strong private property laws that basically said, are you a war criminal in Africa with a lot of money? Are you a Russian oligarch with billions?
Yep.
This is your new home.
Yep.
We love you. Welcome to London. And to be fair, I think it's been great for London. I've been coming to London 1 to 4 times a year for 50 years. I used to come here as a little boy, and it's gone through a multi-trillion-dollar facelift over the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure it's been because of British innovation. I think the innovation has been creating a great culture, an amazing city, really strong education system. So I guess you could argue that's innovation. But basically, they've attracted, billionaires have kind of 2 things in common, or 1 thing in common. They own homes in New York and London, and they bring their money in because their money is safe in London. No, it's kind of out of the reach of people, and also it has good food here and a nice environment, a progressive culture. But is there really any underlying innovation here? And again, this feels a little bit like, what was that book, Butler to the World, mm-hmm. UK? And that is, they've said, oh, regulation got you down in the US? Come to London. Wink, wink. We'll be more hands off in terms of your pump and dump crypto schemes.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's what we wrote about last year when we were talking about, you wrote that post, WASH, for No Mercy, No Malice. And yeah, London has it all. It's got lax financial regulation. It's got the lowest corporate tax rate in the G7. They have pretty aggressive tax credits, protections on trusts. And we brought up this historical example, which is that in the 1700s, the king introduced this law called the non-domicile tax system, which basically said that anyone living in the UK whose quote-unquote real home is abroad doesn't have to pay taxes. And that still exists today. And the prime minister's wife is a non-dom. She recently had to revoke that status because there was so much controversy over it. But she's the heiress of an Indian billionaire whose real home was in India, never had to pay taxes. So yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on here. The only thing that I would offer that I'd like to get your take on is, the Mayor Suarez of Miami, he sort of did this play and it kind of worked. Mm-hmm. He said, bring low regulation here, low taxes, bring in all the tech, bring in all the crypto people, and people moved there. And it did sort of jumpstart the economy. So do you think that it's reasonable for Rishi Sunak to be basically doing the same play?
Yeah, look, trying to attract companies and capital, good for him. It just strikes me that it's pretty desperate when you're talking about someone bringing over 50 jobs. It just, a bunch of rich white dudes from, if they're venture capitalists, chances are they're from Stanford or Harvard, and there's 50 of them, and the prime minister's announced. I just made me feel, it's just too bad for London. And also London, and similar to the U.S., you talked about Florida and Miami. It's sunshine and low taxes. I don't think it's a focus on an industry. I think the crypto bro movement in Miami has probably backfired on the Miami brand.
Right.
Because it just comes across as sketchy. There's a certain kind of bro-y, too much or too little testosterone feel to all of it. And I don't think it's been good. I don't think over the long run. It might have been a short term kind of sugar high, but I don't think Miami attracting crypto has done it any favors. Being a business or perceived as a business friendly state with zero state federal taxes, which by the way they get back a lot of it as a Florida homeowner and in real estate taxes. My taxes
Right.
on my home are like I think over 2% a year of its assessed value.
Right.
But sunshine and low taxes have been the primary migration forces in the U.S., and that is people from California and New York have moved to Texas and Florida, respectively. But I think when all's said and done, crypto, Jesus fucking Christ, can we just stop talking about crypto? Let's like
Yeah,
talk
I'm
about a
down.
market that's bigger,
Yeah.
like pastel lampshades or something. Who cares? Who cares?
I agree. I totally agree. But it's tough when the prime minister of a G7 nation is like touting it as the future when, yeah, I thought we had all agreed that it was slightly behind us.
Yeah, and I like him. I like the prime minister. He strikes me as a reasonable, smart man. I hope he does well. And I realize that politics over here are different, but with the parliamentary system. But I think he's been actually a steady hand. But yeah, this one made no sense. There's this guy named Patty Haverson who was the kind of head of comms for the palace and now runs this very successful communications firm here in London. And I just would imagine that he's a really bright guy, really a blue flame thinker. I can't imagine if he were working at 10 Downing or whatever the number is.
Right.
Is it 10 Downing?
It's 10, yeah.
I can't imagine if he was working at 10 Downing, he would have let him put out this press release. It'd be like,
Yeah.
okay, boss.
Yeah.
Okay. This is good for them, makes you look small.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if you saw, but on the door of 10 Downing Street, the comms department installed all these other zeros and ones to be like a binary code message. We're now the tech hub. What do you think of that as a parliamentary comms strategy?
Well, I'm not sure there's a ton of wood behind that arrow. Actually, the UK has raised a lot of money for fintech companies.
Right.
Its unicorns have a greater market capitalization than any nation in Europe, including double that of Germany. So you got to give it. London and the UK have been friendly and successful around fintech companies. So I don't know. It feels a little bit gimmicky.
Yeah.
Whatever. I can't see the White House, putting windmills in its front lawn or paper mache windmills to say we're the new renewable capital. Maybe. Who knows?
Let's move on to our third story. It's official. Bud Light is no longer America's #1 beer, a title it's held since 2001. This story began after transgender influencer Dylan Mulvaney posted a promotional video that revealed a personalized can that Bud Light had sent her. That video quickly went viral, and conservatives called for a boycott against Bud Light for working with a trans person. In the following weeks, the brewer put 2 marketing executives on leave and said it would stick to sports and music marketing in the future. But that attempt to wade out of the controversy garnered criticism from the left that the company should have stood by its spokesperson and the LGBTQ+ community. Since the controversy, sales have declined dramatically, down 24% year over year. 2 months ago, Bud Light was the best-selling beer in the US with 10% market share. Today, that number is 7%. It is now second to the new bestseller, Modelo Especial. Meanwhile, shares in the parent company Anheuser-Busch have fallen roughly 15% since the video was posted, and that's compared to the S&P 500, which gained 7% during the same period. Scott, what's your initial reaction to this?
I was disappointed. I was really discouraged, just because it strikes me that our nation has become, we've now politicized beer. And you could argue, well, they politicized it, but I looked at the TikTok videos and I thought they were lovely. And it just, it kind of indicates something ugly about America, that just because a transgender influencer does a promotional video, that offends you so much and you have such a disdain for this community that you decide to stop buying the beer. I just felt really like heavy when I read this. I thought, that's really where we are as a nation. What's funny is the #1 beer, Modelo, is actually owned by AB InBev in all markets outside of the U.S. In the U.S., it's owned by Constellation Brands. I would argue, I was even thinking of looking at AB InBev because I wonder if the stock's been overpunished here.
Mm-hmm.
But what it also indicates is that when Colin Kaepernick bent a knee or refused to bend a knee or whatever it is, or bent a knee for the national anthem,
Yep.
viewership, I guess, of the NFL went down, but then it rebounded. Bud Light has a lot of substitutes. And this is pulse marketing, but I wonder if a lot of people stop drinking, not so much because they're anti-trans, at least I hope not, but they just don't want to be involved with anything that is politicized one way or the other. They don't care. And
Right.
two, there's so many substitutes. Beer is just, you're dealing with you're on such a fragile foundation. CNN's ratings down 60%. You think, oh my God, how could they have fucked up so badly? People were looking for an excuse to stop watching cable news.
Right.
Because every other cable station is down. MSNBC brags that it's only down, I think, 17 or 24%. Fox is down more. Beer is built on a really weak foundation now, because for the past 10 plus years, people have been moving away from beer to spirits. I can validate this, Ed. I can validate this. Christ, even gin is making a comeback.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hurting beer. And so when you have a ton of substitutes, when people are sort of looking for a reason to switch beverage altogether, and then you have a community, or you have the U.S., which is just so politicized right now and seems to be so angry, the whole thing kind of bummed me out. From an investment standpoint, I thought I'm going to look at AB InBev because I think it's been overpunished. They have such a diversified portfolio. I just wonder if this stock might be kind of oversold. So anyways, I've been looking at AB InBev and trying to understand its valuation and its prospects.
Yeah. I mean, when I originally saw that AB InBev owns Modelo, I didn't understand the full context, which you brought up, which is that actually they only own the non-US business of Modelo. And my initial reaction was this boycott is going to be useless because they're just redirecting dollars to the same place. That's not the case. But it does bring up an interesting conversation, which is that AB InBev owns countless other beer brands like Stella Artois, Michelob Ultra, Natty Light. They own all these beers. So it feels like to do an effective boycott of this brand is difficult because you need to know the laundry list of brands that
you need to stop
AB InBev
drinking
owns.
beer.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is like, how consequential will this boycott actually be in the long term? Do you think that the conservatives who are upset about this will care about this enough to keep that laundry list front of mind?
No, they'll move on to the next hateful weirdness.
Right.
But the thing is, a decline in market share from 10 to 7% in CPG is a meltdown. I mean, that's a total meltdown. I mean, that's a 30% decrease in sales. I mean, that's just a meltdown.
Yeah.
So will it rebound? I don't know. But this is a 5-car alarm when you're a CPG company and you lose 30% of your share.
Yeah.
So it'll be really interesting to track it and see if it comes back. And even I said this on Pivot today.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about right when this happened and the controversy broke out about taking a selfie of myself with a Bud Light and then posting it to Instagram and Twitter. And then I thought, okay, beyond my desire to virtue signal and show my progressive bona fides, am I just making things worse? Mm-hmm. Is the problem that we have politicized brands and people just don't want to be involved in any brand that for whatever reason unfairly, has been politicized?
Yeah.
And so I thought, am I just making things worse? Am I just getting people angry for whatever reason, putting more transgender people in harm's way from bullshit hate? This is such a small community of people, mm-hmm. and it's getting a disproportionate amount of bullshit and hate from people.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, not that I don't want to say they're unimportant, but this is where we're going to allocate. On the far left, we've decided that fighting for their rights is, agenda number one. And then on the far right, that needs to be the subject of your hate. Here's an idea. Just let them fucking be. I mean, why are we going to the mat in any direction on this? They deserve the same rights as anybody else. They get to drink beer. They get to be influencers. Like, where is all this coming in? Anyways, I'm totally verklempt. That's the wrong word. I'm totally out of sorts about this, Ed. I don't know what to think. What do you think of this?
I agree with everything you said. One thing that I wanted to get your take on is, as a brand person, was it a mistake to have a transgender person promote the brand? Do brand managers and brand executives need to take into account the fact that trans issues are massively political issues? And the argument's pretty clear here. It's like, we need to advocate for these people who are marginalized and discriminated against and treated horribly, as we've seen from this whole pushback. Or do brand executives need to say, okay, well, despite that, my job is to make the company money, so I just need to never touch anything like this? Technically, it was one of the biggest branding failures of the year. It's horrible to say that because, they did nothing wrong. But I wanted to get your take on that.
So if the question is, did they make a mistake using a transgender influencer for any of their marketing, I would argue the mistake was not standing behind her.
Right.
And that is to not include transgender members of the transgender community in influencer marketing because you're worried about the politicization. I hate to say it, you need to make that judgment call. And I can understand someone saying, you know what, it's too hot right now. We're not going to do it. We're not in the business of advancing the rights of transgender people. And whatever that says about us, it says about us, but we're just not, we don't want to touch it. I think I could understand that decision.
Yep.
Where they fucked up, and I know the people from AB InBev, and they're really good people and really smart. It's a really well-run company. Where they fucked up is believing that if they backed away from it or apologized, it would mean anything to the crazies. It doesn't. The crazies aren't there to try and change your behavior. The crazies are there to find reasons to flex their hate muscles.
Yep.
And this was an opportunity for AB InBev to say, we stand behind our brothers and sisters across the entire spectrum. Full stop. We stand. This is an impressive young woman, and we were happy to send her our great Bud Light. We welcome anyone into our community that enjoys Bud Light, and we enjoyed the video. And more power to your sister. That's what they should have said. Instead, they backed down and said, "Yeah, I mean, they just couldn't." It's not the crisis that fucks you. It's how you handle it. Mm-hmm. And this is where they screwed up. You need, they just should have said, well, of course we sent it to her. Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we? We sent this beer and asked people to make videos. I think they sent them to like either dozens or hundreds of people. Of course we did. Of course we did. We're an American company, and America believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're not going to get in the way of anyone's pursuit of happiness. And instead, they backed down, which bought them, curry no favor with the crazies and only upset everyone. So, a crisis turns into crises based on how you handle it. Mm-hmm. And they missed this one.
Mm-hmm. And then what do you think about the beer category as a whole? I mean, you mentioned gin's on the way up. Hard seltzer is also on the way up. The total US beer volume last year declined 3%. And then there's also this demographic trend, which is that young people don't actually like drinking that much now. Gen Z drinks 20% less alcohol per capita than millennials did at their age. The share of college-age adults who don't drink has grown from 20% to 28% in the past 2 decades. It feels like beer is on the way out. Do you think that this whole controversy is going to worsen things for the category?
Well, again, people are looking for an excuse to abandon a sector in structural decline. So when CNN airs the Trump town hall and it angers a lot of people, they were looking for an excuse to stop watching cable news, right? Yeah. When people feel like a brand in beer it gets too politicized, they're looking for an excuse to stop drinking beer. I don't know what the trends are across drinks. What I do see as a trend, and of course, I know everything about young people and consumption and drug abuse because I just came back from Summit at Sea. But what struck me is that
can you describe what you observed at Summit at Sea?
Well, Summit at Sea is basically the way to think of it is Learning Man, and that is they take over a ship, a Virgin cruise ship, And all day long, they have people speaking on all manner of subjects, usually AI, of course. Oh, we're all dead. The robots are taking over. Give me a fucking break. And then, and then people like me, and then more interesting, credible people like Simon Sinek. And then at night, we go to see DJs and do drugs and drink and meet new people, and everyone's very friendly. A lot of hugging, and have dinner with random strangers who used to own a social media influencer agency are now pivoting into executive coaching. So we need to produce more executives to give all these young people jobs.
Oh, my God.
But I couldn't get over the number of people who have altered their intake from alcohol to drugs. And I'm not talking about meth or even MDMA or Molly. It was the kind of the combo, the peanut butter and chocolate combo I saw was chocolate mushrooms, and then you kind of nurse a drink. Mm-hmm. And I can speak from experience that mushroom chocolates is in fact a good high. 3 people offered me mushroom chocolates. The third time I said yes. And then I went back to my cabin. I got even less social and watched that video of those rhesus monkeys attacking a box of Cheetos. And I watched that video like 85 times, and Ed, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And I thought to myself, okay. All these studies are coming out. I'm obsessed with this guy, Dr. Peter Attia. Dr. Attia, if you're out there and you want to come on the podcast, please come on. I'm thinking a lot more about my health. I've always been fairly strong. I've always been fairly fit, but now I need to figure out my diet and my alcohol consumption. And my weak point is I drink too much alcohol. Mm-hmm. And all of these studies are coming out saying, okay, alcohol just is really not good for you. And I like the idea of moving to edibles, THC edibles, or even mushroom chocolate and drastically reducing my intake of alcohol. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's a healthier way to go. And it struck me that these young, very informed, very kind of information age millennials and Gen Zs, that's where they appear to be moving. They still drink, but they'll have 1 or 2 drinks, not 5, and they'll chase it with mushroom chocolate or edibles. Mm-hmm. So I think the whole category of drinks is probably, as you referenced, probably going to see some structural decline. Monkey videos. That's the summary here. Monkey videos.
Let's go to Mia on the street.
What is your drink of choice, and what do you think it says about you?
I like kombucha. And I think it just gives a false perception that I'm very granola.
Honestly, I don't really drink that much, but I usually get either a vodka sour.
Mine's a cider or a twisted tea.
I don't drink, so I wouldn't know.
All good.
I hate beer. It tastes like piss.
Espresso martini.
I'm a Corona with a lime kind of guy.
And if I'm going out, maybe a margarita. Yeah. And I don't know, what it says about me, I'd probably just say, I like to stay, crisp and hydrated, refreshed.
No, I love to hydrate with a margarita. Do you feel like in the past couple of years, maybe had more beer or less beer as a percentage of kind of your alcohol consumption?
I definitely scurry away from it because it's just nasty to me, kind of.
Same.
Not gonna lie. But if I do, it's gonna be a Stella.
Beer makes me feel very puffy the next day, as opposed I could have a few margaritas or mojitos or something a little light and feel a little nicer and maybe eat a little better and everything like that.
Yeah, aging, man. It's
For
crazy.
Sure. It's crazy. It's honestly crazy. I used to love beer. Natty Daddies, those big old cans. Yeah, I could probably slug 2 or 3 of those back in my heyday.
Me, I'm a Heineken man. I drink 2 Heinekens a day. After work, go home, eat, sleep, and do the same thing again.
Yeah. And what about Bud Light? Is not so good?
I think Bud Light is good. Bud Light is more for the ladies and whatnot.
What do you think of when you think of someone who drinks Bud Light? Who is that in your mind?
That's your creepy uncle. My stepdad.
Yeah, that's really good.
Totally fair.
He loves Bud Light, man. I don't know.
Midwest, jeans, maybe a flannel shirt.
Harry, jeans, shotgun in the back.
What do you think of the recent controversy, if I may ask?
I know that voice of people, the voices of people who are choosing to not drink the beer, definitely has a huge weight, I think, on America, especially right now, because Target took down a lot of their Pride stuff, and Starbucks is starting to now. And all this legislation, too, against, like, the community, it's just things are going backwards instead of forward.
How about you?
I love it. Let's make everything gay.
Thanks, Mia. Okay, let's take a look at the week ahead. We'll see housing starts and existing home sales data for May, and Fed Chair Jerome Powell is once again testifying before the Senate Banking Committee on the state of U.S. monetary policy. Do you have any predictions for us?
I think Live PGA is not a done deal. It just strikes me that this is going to get, when people realize a sport has been taken over by the kingdom, I don't know. It strikes me this is not going to be a smooth transaction. And it may ultimately go through, but I think there's going to be a lot of posturing and arm waving, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's congressional hearing. This to me, this is bigger than, the Qataris or whoever it was that bought Newcastle. This is a sport.
Yep.
And I would imagine there's a lot of, I'm going to go out on a limb here, white Republicans who enjoy golf who are going to go, I guess it's how they sell it. This will be great for golf, and, we're going to invest a massive amount of money for it. But it strikes me that the Live PGA deal, we're going to hear a lot more about this.
I don't know if you saw also, but last week your prediction was that Jay Monahan would take some sort of, he would step down to hang out with his family, i.e. he'll get pushed out, he'll get fired. He's on medical leave right now. Now, he's probably legitimate.
For what? Like assholeitis? He's having a hypocritic
hesitant to bring it up because,
hypocritectomy?
Yeah, suffering from guilty conscience. No, I was hesitant to bring it up because I'm sure I don't want to insinuate.
When we find out tomorrow
legitimate.
he died of cancer, we're going to feel pretty shitty.
Exactly. But do you have any,
yeah, my guess is that's total bullshit. My guess is he's hiding somewhere in a home in Kauai, or he's hiding at the whatever it is, whatever that hotel is that all the VCs go to on the Big Island. Yeah, look, let me put it this way. If we find out that Jay is okay, I won't be entirely shocked. So for him and his family, I genuinely, two things. I do hope that he's healthy.
Yeah.
And I think he's lying. I don't. Anyways, if I had basically held the hands of 9/11 widows while selling my company to the kingdom, if I had a mole taken and that became public and I had a mole taken off my head, which I did last week, I might decide to go on medical leave too.
Well put. We'll see if that stays in.
Okay. Thank you for watching this version of Prof G Markets. Check out our pod feed for office hours on Wednesday, and we'll be back with a fresh take on markets every Monday.